So, welcome to this leadership lecture. This is the inaugural lecture for 2021 in our leadership lecture series. We've been doing this for about 5 years now, and we're very pleased tonight that you are able to join us. We typically have faculty members and alumni that do this lecture for us. And this year is the first time we have not had it live, and we're actually doing it via Zoom. So we're very excited that we're able to have people from all over the US. And who knows, there may even be some people from outside of the US that are attending tonight. Um, Already, we have about 30 people already that have joined us. So let me introduce our speaker, and then we'll let Dr. Oliver get started. She will speak tonight for about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for a Q&A at the end. And if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to write your questions and address them to everyone in the chat box, which is available to be accessed on the bottom of your screen. You might have to push the three little dots to find it, but you should be able to chat to everyone. If you have a specific question that comes up during the talk, we'll deal with those at the last 15 minutes tonight of the lecture. So let me introduce Dr. Oliver. Dr. Oliver came to the University of Arkansas at Little Rock in 2017. Is
Eight.
that 18? Okay, I knew I was close.
It's been a long year.
Yeah, she's an assistant professor, and she came by way of Arizona State University, got a PhD in human communication there, and has been studying for quite some time family communication and family resilience in the areas, especially with step families and post-divorce and blended families. And that's what she's going to be talking tonight. She's really looking at the challenges that are typical, that might be typical and typically found in restructured families, how families can use communication to be resilient, to help deal with issues that they would be facing in their families. She also is a published researcher and a certified group facilitator. So if any of you are needing groups facilitated for something, you might contact Dr. Oliver after this is over, and she could tell you kind of what she does in terms of that. She has her work published in the Journal of Applied Communication Research, the Journal of Family Communication, and she's won top paper awards at national conventions, was recently featured on NPR One Radio, and was awarded the 2019 Sandra Petronio Dissertation Award from the National Communication Association. So Dr. Oliver, I call her Bailey, welcome, and we're excited to hear from you tonight. So I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen real quick. So can everyone see my screen? Thumbs up. You can see it.
Right now we're seeing all of your screen. There you go.
Okay, there we go. All right, so thank you, April, so much for that introduction. And like she mentioned, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat box addressed to everyone. And hopefully I'll have enough time at the end to address each of them. So to start out tonight, I just kind of want to start by telling a story of a lovely lady and a man named Brady. Oh, okay. I think we all know where this is going. You might be probably pretty familiar with this story. The Brady Bunch ran from 1969 to 1974, and it's been syndicated ever since. And it really tells the story of a quintessential traditional American family. But this family is really not that traditional, especially during the time period of its run. So many people forget that this, quote, traditional American family, the Brady Bunch, is actually about a step family, and one that includes two existing family units coming together to form a large, complex step family. And actually, it would be more reflective of America today than during its era. Now, although some step families, like the Brady Bunch, form during post-bereavement or the death of a parent, today most step families form after divorce and remarriage. So step families are actually the most prevalent modern day family form that exists right now. Less than half of children in the US are living in first marriage two-parent households, And step families account for 40% of all US married couples with children. Now, what this means is that 16% of all children in our country are actually living in what's called a blended family at any given time. Now, these facts might not be that shocking to you, but I've been tracking their trends for almost a decade now. And like Dr. April mentioned, I received my MA in Communication Studies, my PhD in Human Communication, and I've been researching and publishing step family research for a little over 9 years now. But I have also been a part of a step family for much longer, since before I was 10 years old. And growing up, I wanted to know why my experiences were different than what I was reading about in the news, on blogs, and hearing about from others. Now, more recently, I have found myself in the shoes of the exact people that I have been studying. So as a stepmom, I have a 6-year-old bonus daughter who I love dearly, who's been in my life for almost 2 years now. And this role has really made me, as you can imagine, all the more passionate about what I study. So I'm what people call a conflict transformation researcher. Now, this means that I study the dark side of communication to get to the light. And today I really want to share with you what I've learned as a step family conflict transformation researcher and how you can use everyday, not extraordinary things and practices to hopefully foster more positive and resilient step family relationships. So yes, we will talk about the challenges to step families. So that's the dark side, right? But we also have to talk about how to combat such challenges and create positive and resilient relationships over the life course. So that's the light. So I'm going to start with discussing these challenges, but then we're going to talk about research from my own research and other step family scholars on how to cultivate positive relationships as step parents, as step siblings or half siblings, and as a whole family unit. So we'll also have time for Q&A at the end. So again, if you have questions, post them in the chat feature. So first I want to discuss the challenges to step families. But of course, before that, we need to define exactly what we're talking about today. So what is a step family in the first place? First off, they go by many different names. Step families, combined families, restructured families, remarried families, blended families. These actually all refer to the same thing. And that definition is really any family that includes a step parent, a step sibling, or a half sibling. Now, the name blended family is actually the word that's used probably the most now in popular press on step families. And this is a term just for the fact that step families are blending two households together. So the Brady Bunch, there were 3 lovely girls and there were 3 lovely boys that came together under the same residence that, it had this same family unit and blended 2 existing families into one. Now, like I mentioned, much like the Brady Bunch, some do form due to post-bereavement, but most actually form from divorce and remarriage. Specifically in the US, the majority of step and blended families are a result of divorce and remarriage. Now let's talk about the challenges. And step families are faced with 2 types of challenges. They experience challenges first due to being a post-divorced family. So we'll talk about this first. And the number one thing that happens is that children, as well as parents, and we'll talk about this, might feel caught between their divorced parents or their now divorced parents. For example, if 2 exes refuse to talk to each other or confront each other in any kind of meaningful way, unfortunately, a child might be used as the information runner, right? So tell your mom that I need to trade weekends next week. Let me know what she says. If 2 parents aren't communicating with one another, specifically because they're exes, a child might, without the parents necessarily wanting them to be, might be put in the middle or feel caught between these 2 quarreling parents. They might also feel caught between showing loyalty to one particular parent or residence over the other. So they might experience uncertainty and anxiety over showing loyalty to the parent they live with, but also to the one that's their non-residential parent. Now, for both stepchildren and step parents within a step family, divorce oftentimes leads all those family members to experience changed rituals. So rituals are things like your family events, your celebrations, how you spend Christmas, what happens at graduation, how you spend dinner time, whether you talk and you have to put your phones away or what have you. When a family divorces, that's less people usually under the same residence. So these rituals are altered, and that can cause some challenges to the family members. Of course, if you are a step parent, you probably also know the challenges to having a child that is split across residences. And this isn't just true for step families, but for post-divorced families. So putting their clothes in their backpack so the next parent can unpack them when they are picking them up from school. Making sure that they have everything they need, school supplies at both residences. Trying to have a custom or expectations at both residences that might have very different parenting styles. This can cause and be a challenge for both parents as they try to manage these changes, as well as the kids, of course. And for all people post-divorced, whether we're talking about the parents or children involved, people are mourning the loss of the previous relationship. For parents or for spouses, they're having to reimagine their identity apart from this relationship or who they are now that they are getting divorced. Children are likely mourning the loss of the previous family unit. And this includes mourning the loss of a parent who now no longer lives under the same roof. So these challenges are all due to divorce, and they contribute to some of the challenges that step families face. But step families also experience unique challenges because they are remarried. So there's another reunion. Now, it should go without saying that you can be a part of a step family without a legal marriage. So moving in, with someone or before you get married, that still is what we're talking about here. So don't, look too deeply into the word remarriage here. But there are unique challenges after the divorce if a family starts to blend and brings different family units together. And one challenge is that step families are assumed to be negative. Now, this kind of works in two ways. One is that most of research has looked at step families through what's called a deficient comparison approach. And what this means is that a lot of times, up until recently, actually the past 10 years or so, when step families are studied, they're immediately compared to intact two-parent households. So of course there's heightened conflict. There's different rituals, there's different residences, there's more people. But instead of studying how they can be resilient and help address these challenges, the majority of research simply tends to stop there and talk about how they might be deficient or challenged because they're not an intact two-parent household anymore. We also have some master narratives that contribute to this assumption that step families are inherently negative. And these might look familiar because they're a part of the fairy tales that we tell. They're a part of the stories that children hear even when they're young. So this idea that if you have a step parent or step sibling, they might be inherently evil. They might have some kind of ulterior motive. As ridiculous as that may sound, that's a pervasive narrative in our culture. And that, of course, for young children can influence how they view step families, particularly their own step family once they become a part of one. Another challenge due to remarriage is simply that step families do experience heightened conflict between the siblings that are involved. Now, something to keep in mind is that step sibling conflict has been replicated in research, but a lot of the research says, hey, there's more children in the house. So there's heightened conflict because there's more children vying for resources and vying for things, right? So there's not just one child trying to get control of the remote control. There's now three. So it's not necessarily that they're step, but just that there's more children that are now interacting with each other. The snacks are running out quicker because there's more children in the family. So there has been research that's noted that there's increased sibling conflict within step families, but a lot of times their reasoning is simply because there's a new child or an additional person added to the family. Now, this other reason for increased sibling conflict is usually indicative to step relationships. And that is the idea of Can I be open? What information do I reveal or conceal to my step sibling? Can I trust them? Or again, are they inherently evil and have an ulterior motive? Do I tell this secret to my biological sibling and not my step sibling? So this struggle can cause tension within our sibling relationships within a step family because we don't know what's expected when it comes to openness and privacy. Now, for step parents and for really any relationship in the step family, the roles are often ambiguous. For example, if you're a step parent, can you discipline? Do you immediately become a disciplinarian, or do you have to wait on that? What's the time I have to wait before I tell my stepchild I love them? Right? Can I show affection to my stepchild? All of these questions kind of let us know as researchers that step parents particularly experience an often ambiguous role. In fact, step families are what's called discourse dependent. And this is a fancy phrase that scholars use to basically say that step families are relying on roles, rules, and their expectations to be developed on the fly. So discourse dependent families or any non-traditional family structure. So LGBTQ families, surrogate families, foster families, adopted families, they're all considered to be falling outside of traditional structures and norms. So they don't have cultural models and expectations for which to develop and enact their roles and relationships. For example, in a biological family, we usually expect that the mother is the comforter, right? So if a child needs comforting, they can run to their mom. Well, is that true if my mom is my stepmom? Is that true if I have two moms? So this additional confusion or this additional ambiguity about your role is because you're discourse dependent. In typical biological families, fathers are typically the disciplinarian. Again, if your father is your stepfather, if you have two fathers, who plays that role? It's not clear. Cultural models don't make that particularly clear. If you're a younger biological child, the typical, cultural expectation and model is that you look up to and model the behavior of your older biological sibling. Well, if my older sibling is a step sibling, is that still true? Is that still what I'm supposed to do? So discourse dependent families require additional communicative labor to create and validate their family. And this is both within their family and externally as they talk to others about their family. Because they have to, through communication, negotiate these expectations and these roles without having these cultural models. For an example of an internal way that we rely on communication to enact these roles, a lot of times a biological parent needs to confirm in the eyes of a child that the step parent needs to be listened to. Right. So my bonus daughter, multiple times has not listened to me or something, and I've tried to do something about it. It hasn't really worked. And it was really important that my partner say, hey, this is your bonus mom. If she tells you to do something, it's important that you listen to her. That communicative act of my partner having to validate through communication my role is not necessarily that would have to happen in a intact two-parent family household that what doesn't involve step parents. Some examples of external ways we have to communicate this dependence. If anyone asks me about my siblings, I say, well, I have two brothers and a sister. And then if they say, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know that they start looking at me because they know I have a blended family. I then have to say, okay, well, my older brother is technically my stepbrother. My sister's my full biological sister. I have a younger brother. He's much younger than me, but that's because he's my half sibling. He's from my mom and my dad. I have to go through this huge communicative act, right? And that's because I'm part of a complex step family. I have to go through that communicative behavior. Same things with how we, talk about in the words we use to describe our family. So this is my bonus child, not my stepdaughter, right? And that addressing terms matter. So what this tells us is that communication is really key in understanding how to develop these roles and how to develop them in a more positive trajectory. So stage theorists even say and discuss how we tend to start step families with fantasy-like expectations. The idea that dating went well, so we're going to immediately be validated as the parent. We're going to be enmeshed into the rituals, and it's going to go great. But then we are, hit with reality that this smooth transition or fantasy is not necessarily met. So we need to be aware that the first 2 years of a step family are the most turbulent years that usually they experience. So family members in these first 2 years are still trying to fall into their roles. They're still trying to lower uncertainty, use communication cues to figure out what they should be or how they should act in regards to the next step family, to the new step family. And really 4 years are what family scholars argue are the make it or break it years for step families. Now, what's unfortunate is that most blended and step family scholars do not study step families longitudinally. They only study them from 1 to 4 years. So it makes sense that what they're finding is that it's inherently negative, that there's a lot of conflict. So I've been working with a cross-institutional research team that has been looking at positive step family relationships past these 4 years. In fact, how these positive relationships are cultivated over time into adulthood and what practices have contributed to that. So let's look at some of that work and how we can cultivate positive and resilient step family relationships. So we've looked at the challenges, the dark side. Let's look to the light. And we're going to start with the most studied role within the step family, and that's the role of the step parent. Now, to give you some background where I get some of these practices from is on that cross-institutional research team, we interviewed adult stepchildren from ages 25 to 52. And we interviewed them because they currently said that they have a positive relationship with their step parent. And we asked them to tell us what turning points, which are really any event that alters a relationship in some important way, that contributed to your currently positive relationship with your step parent. So we wanted to know over time, what were the events that stuck out to you? Now, a couple years later, we did this same study from the perspective of the step parent. Okay, so we've gotten the view of what stepchildren say are the most significant events and what the step parents say are the most significant events of creating a positive long-term relationship between a stepchild and step parent. And the first one has been published, as you can see here. The other one is in the works. Fingers crossed that will be released soon. So what did we find? Well, from the perspective of stepchildren, the number one most significant turning point that they reported was pro-social actions. And these are out of the ordinary efforts by a step parent. These included things like gift giving, substantial friendly gestures, acts of kindness. These were all so important that even though these happened sometimes when they were a child, they remembered them 10, 20 years down the road as being something that contributed to their positive relationship. So an example from my own life, my stepmom was the first one that took me to get my nails done. She was the first one that I learned what highlighting hair even was, and I got my hair highlighted for the first time with her. That eventually actually turned into a tradition that we did quite frequently while I was growing up, because this was something that she did for me and with me in mind. So I remember that to this day because that was a pro-social action. Another participant that we had in one of our research studies talked about how important it was that their step parent let them paint their own room, right? The step parent even got with the biological parent and kind of persuaded the biological parent to let the child paint their room. As simple as that behavior was, that was extremely significant to this stepchild who was a teenager at the time, of having that independence and having an ally as a parent to do that for them. A lot of pro-social actions that were mentioned in the research were also actions that the step parent did because a biological parent either couldn't or refused to do so. For example, multiple stepchildren talked about the significance of being walked down the aisle by a step parent instead of a biological parent, because the biological parent either couldn't be there, they had passed away, or they refused to be there. So there was some kind of bad relationship. Even things like simple things like a step parent picking them up from school or coming to a parent teacher night when the biological parent couldn't or refused to be there. These were significant. These actually cultivated a more positive relationship that they remembered years down the road. Now, another turning point that was important, not just from the perspective of stepchildren, but also from the perspective of step parents, is simply spending quality time with one another. So, small talk in the car, discussing interest, finding shared interest, doing a hobby or activity jointly together. This was a time for the relationship to basically exist without the intervention of a biological parent or without the need of other siblings to be present as well. So, just spending quality time with one another was one way to personalize the relationship. And again, give this step parent and stepchild something that was uniquely theirs and a part of their relationship. Now, another thing that was reported both from the perspective of a stepchild and step parent was effective problem solving and conflict management. Now, positive relationships resulted from step parents and stepchildren who actually confronted conflict and worked through it instead of letting it fester or sweep it under the rug. Now, like I mentioned, there are a lot of challenges to step families. In fact, the first 2 years are the most turbulent that they're going to experience. So conflict's not inevitable, but how you manage conflict is a choice. So this is really important for step parents to keep in mind that if there's conflict, if they perceive that there's some kind of issue at hand, that they address it and that they approach it instead of avoiding it or sweeping it under the rug. Because if you think, your stepmom said something bad about you and you never bring it up to her or she never brings it up to you, every action she does in the future, you're going to view through the lens of having that negative experience with her. So it's really, really important to have effective problem solving and conflict management. And of course, when your stepchildren are young, this sometimes is on the onus of the step parent, right? On how to manage conflict, how to problem solve. One thing I like to tell any parent, whether they're part of a step parent or not, is that conflict styles are learned behaviors. And who do children learn the most from when they're growing up? Their parents. So if you display negative conflict management with your ex-spouse, with your current spouse, with others within the household, your child is likely to emulate that behavior, and that can spill over into their sibling relationships or even into their school and peer relationships as well. So managing conflict, when you do manage conflict, especially in the role of a step parent, it's really important that you reiterate that your role is to support the stepchild and to use the whole family's values as a way to problem solve. An example from my own life, my bonus daughter got on yellow one day, which if she's in first grade, yellow is not the worst, but it's not the best. She wanted to be on purple and green, which means that her conduct was really good. And when she got in the car, she was very distraught to tell us that she got yellow. She was crying. She was saying that she was afraid that we were going to get onto her, that we wouldn't love her anymore. And because I was in the car, it was important that I was part of the problem solving event, right? She wasn't just telling this to her dad, she was telling it to me as well. So how we explained it is we said things like, tomorrow's a new day. You get to start over tomorrow and you don't have to be on yellow. Also, never be afraid to tell us if you feel like you failed at something, because we're here to support you. In this family, if you fail, we'll still love you no matter what. So that information coming not just from her dad, but from me was really important in this problem solving event, because I'm using my role, I'm communicating to her what my role is to support you. And I'm using our whole family values as a way to talk through that conflict. So something to keep in mind. We've mentioned rituals previously, and rituals are also important, and were important from the perspective of both stepchildren and step parents. The number one thing when it comes to rituals is that this is difficult to do, but if possible, you should try to blend old rituals with new rituals. So old rituals that happened before the family divorced and remarried, and new rituals that you develop as a new step family. So it's important to honor those old traditions, but it's also important to create your own traditions and rituals with a new step family or in a new step family configuration. For example, if you have Christmas Eve at your dad's side and Christmas afternoon at your mom's side, maybe use that breakfast time as a way to just spend time with your dad and your stepmom and create some kind of ritual. Eat breakfast in your pajamas. Have something new that's unique just to your stepdad and your stepmom. So a ritual that they can be a part of and that can be a part of that new step family relationship. Now, I have a ritual that I do that is indicative with my stepfather, and that is that he knows I love to cook. And half the reason I love to cook is because he loves to eat what I make so much. So when I lived across the country for a significant amount of time, every time I came home, and I kind of still do this, I made it a point to make him something, right? Make him something that he wanted. It was kind of a joke at first, but now it's literally a ritual that we have every time I come home. And that's something that is, of course, multiple people in the family can benefit from, but that's a ritual just between me and my stepfather. So something that is just a part of our relationship that helps make it positive. Now, the last thing for step parents, and this is mainly perceived by step parents, so stepchildren didn't necessarily report this, but for step parents, your role is quite difficult. And one reason it's difficult is because you have to navigate the dialectic of being both a friend and a parent to your stepchildren. You also have to manage the dialectic of being a supporter, but also a fierce protector when needed. So, at first, the research does tell us that it is helpful to start as a friend. Oftentimes, especially if your kids are in late adolescence or teenage years, you can't immediately join a family as a disciplinarian, no matter your gender or sexual, your sex. So, oftentimes it is helpful to create that friendship first and then to go into and build up to the disciplinary role. When you do get into that more parental disciplinary role, it's important to have support by the biological parent, and that to be clearly communicated. So past research shows it's absolutely important for the biological parent to validate the step parent as a disciplinarian in the eyes of the stepchild. Now, first, other than just a friend, stepchildren also want to feel supported. So they want to have a step parent that's there for them. They want to have someone that's, simply present, that's available when needed, that can be an open ear. And if you've built up this friendship first, you might find that your stepchildren actually come to you with more information. My bonus daughter sometimes tells me things before she tells her father. And I know that can also be because we have the same, gender and sex, but sometimes that's because we've spent so much time building up that friendship first. Now, what's important is that no matter their age, stepchildren do desire and benefit from step parents eventually taking on a more parental role. So, helping them get ready in the morning with school, teaching them a skill or helping them apply to college, offering them protection or defending them when needed. These are elements that are usually indicative of biological parents that are also desired by stepchildren from the step parent as well. Now, what makes these dialectics so difficult is that step parents really have to be attuned to the subtle communication from their stepchildren to see when they need to be a friend or a parent, when they need to be a supporter or a protector. And I, again, have an example about my stepfather when it comes to this. I got in trouble in high school. Doesn't matter what it was for, but I got in trouble in high school and I got grounded from my car. And my car happened to be at a friend's house. So we had to drive to get my car. And because I was grounded from it, I couldn't drive my car back home. One of my parents had to. So my stepdad drove my car back home, which is hilarious because I drove a tiny Volkswagen Beetle, bright blue, and my stepfather is about 6'4", very burly man inside this tiny car. So it was already comical, but I wasn't laughing that day because I had just gotten in a lot of trouble. And I was in the passenger seat. We're driving home. I'd gotten in trouble by all parents in multiple ways that day. And he could tell from how I was acting, how I was communicating, that I didn't need a disciplinarian at that time. I didn't need to be reminded what I did and how much in trouble I was. Instead, on the way home, he told me stories about when he was in high school. He told me about when he got in trouble in high school. There wasn't a huge moral of the story or anything. It was simply just he could tell that I needed someone to empathize with me. I needed someone to be there for me. And how did he know that? He picked up on subtle communication cues and knew that he needed to foster more of that supporter role than necessarily a disciplinarian. So step parents, you have a hard job, but it is possible keeping some of these practices in mind. Third, I want to talk about what siblings can do within a step family. And I'm going to talk both about step siblings and what half siblings can do. Now, for step siblings, it's important to understand that much of the conflict that you experience, again, is due to vying for and sharing resources. So, the number one resource that you're probably vying over is your parents' attention and time. So your biological parent has now, if you're in a step family, has also become a step parent to another child or maybe multiple children. So their time and attention is stretched. You desire and you seek that original time and attention. So that's going to cause conflict between you and your sibling. If we're talking about just everyday resources here, you might now have to share a room. There might be only one TV in the house or one computer that you have to share. So you're again experiencing conflict over less resources and more people. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that conflict is more likely simply due to vying for resources and not necessarily an internal characteristic of your new sibling, right? So your step sibling is not trying to steal your biological mom away from you. They might just be in more need of time to make up for lost time and get to know your mom. So having that reframing of, okay, my step sibling isn't inherently evil and trying to steal my mom away, but maybe they just need to catch up because I've had my mom for all these years and my step sibling hasn't. That simple reframing, as hard as it is to do sometimes, can have a positive outcome on your relationship with this step sibling. Now, when conflict does arise, it's important to communicate to your biological parent when you do, in fact, need independence away from a step sibling. So I know step families who have, daughter days or traditions that are just between a biological parent and a biological child. And that doesn't mean that they exclude a stepchild or stepchildren from anything, but when that is needed by a stepchild, that is also fostered as well. So if you're a step sibling and you feel like you're not getting that one-on-one time, or you need that additional time just one-on-one with a biological parent or a biological sibling, it's important that you assert that need and again, use family values and your role within the family to communicate that. Now, another thing that can help build positive relationships between stepchildren is again, spending time through engaging in joint activities. So finding common interest, finding common hobbies, spending quality time with one another, sharing video games, watching a TV show, talking about something, that happened in the media that you both agree with, right? So these joint activities, much like any relationship, help you learn about the other, lowers your uncertainty about them, and can build up liking and intimacy. The other comm scholars in this Zoom right now probably know what the mere exposure effect is. For those of you that don't, this is a phrase that says pretty much with anybody, the more time you spend with them, the more you get to understand them, the more you can likely predict their behavior. And research has shown your liking usually increases because you've simply spent time with one another. That mere exposure effect is also true for siblings. Just like any relationship, you have to build it. You have to spend time with one another. So this is especially important for step siblings. Now, this spending time together also usually includes being open. So the only way to build a relationship is to communicate with one another. It's okay to be guarded at first when you start a step family or when you have, a new step sibling. But just like a friendship, you really have to share and be open with one another and know it's okay to talk to one another in order to develop that relationship. And something to keep in mind is that, especially given the remarriage and the divorce, it is okay to talk about your prior life before the remarriage. It's okay to talk about, your biological parent who's not the one married to your step parent. It's okay to talk about, what your old house looked like. If you're both being reciprocal in that openness, that can again foster positive relationships. Now, I also want to talk about what half siblings can do. And if you have no idea what a half sibling is, I'm going to tell you what that is right now. So a half sibling is a brother or sister, so brothers and sisters who are half biologically related. So they share only one biological parent, and therefore they have 25% genetic relatedness. Now, why are we talking about these in the context of step families? Well, an estimated 2/3 of all step families go on to produce half siblings, and usually within a fairly quick turnaround, right? Within the first 4 years of step family formation. 6 out of 10 remarried mothers tend to go on to produce half siblings as well if they're in the reproduction age. So or half siblings are very frequent within step families, and they are unique in having that half biological relatedness. So a lot of step family researchers conflate half siblings into step siblings, assuming that they're one and the same. But there are some unique practices that half siblings can use because they have this biological component to their connection. And the first one is simply addressing terms. And how do I know this? I did an entire thesis and dissertation on half siblings specifically. And this is in press right now, hopefully going to be published soon. And I was specifically looking again at half sibling relationships and how these half sibling relationships can foster positive relationships into adulthood. And like I mentioned, the first thing that's important for half siblings is addressing terms. Now, this was important for a lot of different types of step family relationships, but primarily for half siblings. It was important that when you're talking to or about your half sibling, that you don't use the word half. If you don't use the word half, this confirms the importance, the role, the significance of this child, of this sibling to you. So I have a younger brother who just so happens to be my half brother. So when I talk about him to others, I am simply talking about my brother. I always mention he's my little brother because I have an older brother too, but I rarely use the word half. And at this point, that's just because that's the term I use. But it was strategic growing up because of our age difference and because the fact we have different moms, I didn't want him to ever think that he was not connected to me as much so as my full biological sibling is. So not using that term, not using the word half, does appear to be something that can contribute to positive half sibling relationships. In fact, your addressing terms are important for other step family roles as well. For example, when you are talking about your stepchildren, if it's important to you to call them your bonus daughter instead of your stepdaughter, and helping the child understand that as well, then that's a practice that you should utilize. I particularly use the word bonus mom specifically if I'm talking about children whose parents might not be biologically, or excuse me, might not be maritally connected yet, so they haven't gone through marriage. So sometimes that's difficult for a young child in understanding, how the relationships are connected because their parents live together, but they might not be married. I have even been in step parent relationships where we've had unique nicknames that were indicative of our roles. For example, my sister and I named my stepmom, her name is Miranda. We named her Myrna early on. I think it was probably for a rude reason during the turbulent years, but it's stuck ever since then. So that is a nickname that me and Morgan use to talk about our stepmom, and it's now an endearing term. Same thing with my bonus daughter. She calls me Bales. No one has ever called me Bales. I did not know that was a term for Bailey, but I smile every time I hear it now because I know that's a chosen addressing term from her to me and how she talks about me to others. So other than addressing terms, the last thing that's important for half siblings is, again, openness. But this openness is a little bit unique in that it's important for half siblings to, once the siblings are of an appropriate age, to actually reveal the backstory and the origin story of how their blended family came to be. Now, of course, you can tell this story and make it age appropriate given how old your younger half sibling might be. So I know people who have had young half siblings who have explained it as tummy carriers, right? We share the same dad, but it just happens that you have a different tummy carrier than I do. right? So you're normalizing the connection. You're saying that, this is still a strong relationship, and here's the story of how our family came to be. I know multiple families who have a narrative about how their blended family came to be that they eventually tell their child. Things like, okay, your older sister, your dad used to be married to this other lady and they fell in love and they had your sister. But then sadly, they fell out of love, but that let your dad meet your mom and then they had you. So, as simple as that sounds, it's really important for a half sibling, especially the youngest half sibling whose parents have never probably been divorced, to learn how their blended family came to be. It's important to have that story and to help them engage in sense making and make sense of their blended family. Lastly, I want to give some tips for what the whole family can do to create positive bonds and to create this functioning step family as a unit. And the first thing, and it's probably not what you want to hear, but a lot of this systematic or whole system uh, engagement here is on the onus of the parents. So parents tend to have more work to do than the stepchildren themselves. And the first is for parents to engage in positive parental intervention. And they can do this in multiple ways. One is to simply encourage communication, particularly between your children, whether they're stepchildren or whether they are half siblings. So asking your child to reach out to her stepsister because she's never experienced losing a grandparent before, and you know that she can offer that feedback and that help and that empathy. Being the parent to ask this child to reach out to the stepsister is important. You're actually positively intervening in the sibling relationship. I know that my parents, when I moved away across country, said that we need to have weekly FaceTime chats because your brother is young still, right? And you now live across the country. We still do that to this day, and it's 6 years, 7 years later. That was something that my parents wanted to do that positively contributed to me communicating with my half sibling. For my daughter, her stepsister comes and has sleepovers at our house. That might be a little much for some people to do, but this is really important for us to be one of the mechanism that helps these two siblings, even if they're not in our particular household, bond and connect with one another. This can even be important when you have young stepchildren or half siblings who are drawing about their family in illustrations when they're young. A lot of kindergarten and first grade prompts are draw a picture of your family. So when they bring that home, tell them the other elements that they can add to it. Explain who all, is there and what connection they have. It's also important for this whole family functioning for the parent to intervene in a way to normalize these complex relationships. For example, we had a participant say, whenever I use the word half, or because I was mad at my brother, my mom immediately got mad at me and said, you don't use the term half, especially if you're upset at your brother. That is not, a way to do that. Having a half sibling is the same as having a full sibling. It is a normal thing, right? So a parent communicating in a way to communicate the normalness of having a half sibling. When my half sibling was young, he was in my older sister's wedding. At that wedding, he met a lot of people that were related to me and my sister, but not necessarily related to him. And he was quite confused at who are all these people, right? So how am I connected to all these people? And one important person to meet was my older stepbrother, right? So my stepbrother is not really in any way related to my younger half brother, but it was important for me to introduce them and for our parents to introduce them. So he actually, because he was really young at the time, called him Mr. Blake, and he was Mr. Blake for a long period of time. And so it was important that that intervention helped normalize those complex relationships. Even having co-rituals like things like a Christmas card that reflects all of your family members, introducing a child to various family members on both sides of the family at graduation or other ritual events, again, is important to normalize these connections. Now, it's also important, and this is the hardest one oftentimes for parents, to engage in positive parental intervention in a way that will help foster cooperative and co-parental or extra parental relationships across residences, across households. So it is true that if you have a bad relationship with your biological mom, you're probably not going to have a great relationship with the person she marries. If you have a horrible relationship with your biological sister, your stepsister, you're probably not going to think greatly of her father. So it's important to have functioning relationships throughout the family system, throughout this entire family, because it positively contributes to everyone. So having civil interaction, particularly at co-ritual events like birthdays or graduations, is really important. You do not have to be best friends, of course, with your ex or with your ex's new partner, but you should be able to show your child that you can cooperate with one another and spend time with them as a focus at shared events. So I know from my own life that my father walked my sister down the aisle and then handed her off to my stepfather, and he walked her the rest of the way. Again, I know that's not typical of a lot of step family relationships, but that was another reason why I was interested in studying my step family experiences and how these parents really were working really hard to cultivate positive relationships throughout the system. The last suggestion for the whole family is for forgiveness. And I've also published on how forgiveness is important to step families as well. And what it says is that it's really important at times for stepchildren to engage in communicating forgiveness. So, particularly for those turbulent first few years, right? So, my sister and I were really mean to Myrna the first couple years. After some time had passed, we told her how sorry we were. We joke about it now. So that communicating forgiveness is actually important, whether it's on, the need of the child or the parent. It's important to communicate that down the road. It can be helpful because we know communicating forgiveness has a positive outcome. It has a positive effect. So if you are having if you forgive your sister, that might make it easier for you to talk to her mom. That might make it easier to go to a ritual event like Christmas or another thing. So communicating forgiveness doesn't just help you, it doesn't help just the person you've forgiven, but it can actually have a positive systematic influence as well. So in conclusion, today, hopefully you've learned a lot. I've been talking to you for a long time, so hopefully you've learned a lot. And hopefully you learned, yes, there are challenges that step families face, but more importantly, there are ways that step parents, that step and half siblings, and that the whole family can do to foster positive and resilient step family relationships. So things like pro-social actions, spending quality time with one another, blending your rituals, using particular addressing terms, having proper conflict management, parents pro-socially or positively intervening, and even forgiveness can have positive effects on the step family. But overall, sometimes patience is the number one practice, I can tell you. Uh, there are turbulent years. You're going to experience challenges. But if you work and do the work and do these practices, you will have resilient and positive step family relationships into the future. So, no, you might not look like the Brady Bunch, but hopefully you can recognize and understand America's most prevalent modern form now. Thanks. I can stop sharing screen.
That's wonderful, Bailey. We already have 3 questions in the chat. You
wonderful.
may be able to see them, and if you are, I don't necessarily have to facilitate this. So, would you like for me to read them to you, or would you like to just look at them yourself?
I can just read them if that works for you.
That works. That works. Yeah.
Awesome. So Dr. Driscoll asked, might you summarize some of the common misconceptions about communication in step families? Yes. So first off, I feel like I need to address this. There are, first off, common misconceptions about divorce in America in the first place. And some of those common misconceptions is that 50% of all divorces or 50% of all marriages end in divorce. This is actually a inflated statistic. It reached its height in the 80s and 90s and has been slowly declining ever since. So the highest it ever got was to about 43%. And some of you statisticians are probably saying, hey, that's close to 50, but it's not 50. And like I said, it's been slowly decreasing. So right now it's in like the top 30s, so 36, 37%, depending on which state you're a part of. And this divorce statistic has been lowering for a lot of reasons. One, people are waiting to get married longer, so they're doing careers first and then marriages. We also know that there was an influx of divorce after the women's rights movements in the 70s. So that's a common misconception about step families in the first place, that there's more of them now because divorce is more prevalent, right? That's not necessarily the truth. But some of the common misconceptions about communication in step families is that there's an ulterior motive for the communication, right? So I'm being nice to my stepmom because I want something out of her, or I'm being nice to, you know, my step sibling because I want to be able to sit at the cool table at lunch at school or something. So a really common misconception is simply the idea that there are these ulterior motives when new families form and what those particular motives are for each individual. So hopefully that answers your question. Struggles in the communication about whether to be open, whether to be trustful of the step sibling or the step parent because of some of these master narratives and assumptions. Dr. Dahlgren asked, what ideas do you have for future research projects? Yes, so for future research projects, I'm interested in two areas that the research has not really looked at. One is what's called gray divorce. So gray as in older. There is an influx of divorce amongst people 50 and older than there has been in previous generations. So I would be interested in looking at how that affects stepchildren and their larger families. So step grandparents, step aunts, and step uncles, and how this might be unique to step parenting due to being a gray divorcee or a gray remarriage. The other area that I'm interested in, not just for myself, but I hope more people are engaged in future research, is looking at step families that are LGBTQ, right? Unfortunately, you know, our nation did not legalize same-sex marriage until 2015, but some statistics have come out about divorce rates of those in the LGBTQ community. So I would just be interested in what extra communication that they have to enact in order to, again, validate those relationships and roles within their family because they're an even more unique type of discourse dependent family. So Angie Faller asked, how different is the relationship between step siblings and half siblings? Do step siblings or half siblings tend to get along better? The simple answer is that research has not answered that yet. This is good for me in getting published, but not a lot of people study half siblings. In fact, as I mentioned, the majority of research conflates half siblings with step siblings. So they have a category for full biological siblings. They have a category for adopted and foster siblings, which also are two different things. And then a category for step/half siblings. So the research cannot point to that at this point to give a definitive answer about how they are uniquely different. I will tell you they experience a lot of the same conflict, especially if they share a residence, right? So still vying for resources, still trying to get the attention of the shared biological parent. But two things that do make it unique is needing to know that backstory and making sure that they are not denoted specifically by a sibling as half. There's also been some preliminary research that, again, there's not been enough of to make these generalized, you know, arguments for, that some people view half siblings from a mother, so their shared biological parent being the mother, as being a full biological sibling. But if they share a half sibling with their father, their biological father, that's more of a distant half sibling. So there's a lot of cultural aspects that influence that as well. So socioeconomic status, marital status, race and ethnicity that again have not been studied yet for me to give you really any kind of, you know, significant answer to that. So Katie asked, what can extended family members on both sides do to support blended families? This is a great question. And there has been research that looks at step grandparenting. And just like with almost any role in a step family, it's important to communicate that your role, no matter if you're a grandparent, parent, sibling, what have you, is to support those who are part of your family. So narrating what family means to you, having particular addressing terms, using, ritual events as an opportunity to explain how you're connected is really important, especially for young children in a step family, particularly a complex step family, to understand. So it was really important, again, at my sister's wedding, that family members of mine that were related to me on my stepfather's side met my little half brother and told them who they were. Right. So, hi, I am your older sister's aunt on Richard's side. Right. That was actually really, really important for my young half sibling at the time to understand this complex web that he was a part of, because now that he's entering high school at the same high school I went to, I'm sure he's going to get questions like, oh, you're Morgan and Bailey's little brother, oh, are you John's kid or Michelle's kid? Right, so he's going to experience that kind of communication, and he needs to be able to make sense of it. So one tip I have for extended family members is to normalize the relationships. Tell them how you're connected, how you're related, and basically reiterate that your role is to be a part of this family and to support them. Caitlin asked, what can new, recently married step parents do to create a relationship with stepchildren that are grown adolescents? This is a setting where step parents are in their 50s and stepchildren are in their mid 20s. Absolutely. Again, if I study and want to study gray divorce, I can probably answer that more so. But we did see a lot of step parents. So remember, we did the same study from the perspective of stepchildren and step parents. And step parents, a lot of them, and I mean up to like 40%, if I recall correctly, mentioned that when their stepchild had a kid, that was really, really significant in bringing their relationship with them closer. They now get to enact this new role as a grandparent, even if it's a step grandparent, and that actually bonded them with their stepchild even more. So I'm not sure, if this is a part of the particular example that you're asking here, but focusing on the step grandparenting aspect, focusing on whatever is important to that stepchild right now. So supporting them in their career, or as a new parent, or as someone that just went back to school, or what have you. Focusing on that, using that as something that you can have joint activities and shared communication about, as well as being a way that you can communicate your support to them, would be significant. Dr. Jones asked, you mentioned the rhetorical shift from stepchild to bonus child, or stepmom to bonus mom, as a personal choice for folks in blended families. Is this also a noticeable discursive shift in the literature? That is, are researchers transitioning to bonus in their own discourse and theorizing instead of step? That is a great question. And the answer is, it depends on where you publish. I have been publishing in some places that absolutely hate the term blended family. And there's a lot of different reasons for it. And one reason is that it confuses the statistics on step families, right? So if people are using the term blended, step, restructured, reconstituted in a lot of different ways in the literature, the statistics might get a little blurred because the terms are being misused. I don't know particularly if researchers are going to adopt the term bonus more. I know it has been the title of some things, like hot click on me, please. I have this title on things, probably why I put it in my title here. But it's a personal choice for the step parents involved. I particularly use bonus child for multiple reasons. The number one reason being is that me and my partner are not married, right? So we live in the same residence. I don't just want to be the girlfriend, right? I don't just want to be, the partner. She needs to see me, and she does see me in a parenting role, but she has a hard time, because she's 6, articulating what that role is to others. So one way we figured that out was, hey, and I don't remember how we exactly came about it, but you're my bonus child, I'm your bonus mom. I'm on all the things to pick her up, take her on whatever I need for school, field trips, and all that sort of stuff. And if anyone asks, I'm her bonus mom. So I have a feeling that we will see that term more chosen by participants in research, but I'm not sure the theorists and the publishers will run with it just because of some of their issues with the term blended. Morgan Edwards asked, in relation to everything you covered in the presentation, how does the new family navigate the biological mom or dad when the biological mom or dad makes it difficult to move forward and foster positive, resilient relationships? Yes, this is extremely hard. And what the research tells us is that if you have the one bad apple really does spoil the bunch. If you have one step parent or biological parent that is refusing to, communicate in a cordial way, or is purposely trying to sabotage the relationships between a parent and a child, that does have a negative impact on how you parent, how you communicate with your stepchild, how your stepchildren and biological children and half children communicate to one another. So it depends on the age of the stepchild. If the stepchild is an adult and can make the decision, whether or not to hear you out and hear your side versus a parent that might be souring, some of your identity and some of who you are through their words, you could approach it in more of an open disclosure way. If it's a young child or, a non-adult, the best way would be to make sure that when you are talking about the other parent, that you do not characterize them in any negative way. This is really, really hard because we sometimes do not agree with what's happening in the other household. Sometimes we have completely different, philosophical beliefs on existence and teaching and parenting. So one thing to keep in mind is that your children do remember if you speak poorly of someone in the other household. They do repeat if you spoke poorly of someone in another household. And that can really confuse them on, again, that feeling caught between residences. So if that is an issue that you're experiencing, first you should address it with the other adults that are in the family, and make sure that you do not communicate about that with the child present. You don't want to be bad talking the other parent while the child is in earshot. Dr. Tonbray asked, what are the effects of divorce on the self-identity of children? So there's been a lot of research on divorce, and the majority of it is on what happens to children who've experienced divorce. And a lot of the research says that they might have increased eating disorders, they might have more struggles with substance abuse, that they might be less likely to excel in school. And that research that came out, in like the 50s through the 70s, were more so reflective of not being in the traditional expected family unit. Step families are more normal now. Like I said, they're the most common, prevalent, modern family form that exists. So a lot of those markers are actually subsiding because there's more support for step families. There's more, organizations. There's more outreach programs, and simply it's more, just common that you'll know someone that's part of a step family. Some of the effects, though, on a child when it comes to their own identity is mirroring the behavior of their parents. So I joke that I have 4 parents that all serve different purposes. My biological mom is the helicopter mom. I love you if you're listening right now, but you know you are. My father is the embarrassing dad joke dad. My stepfather is the disciplinarian, like, don't get in trouble. You don't want, him to meet your boyfriend in high school. And then my stepmom is my best friend that I can come to about anything. She's not going to judge me. So it was really important for my identity growing up to make sure that I was not just trying to mirror one parent, that I was not just trying to connect my identity in one parent, but I was actually learning from all of them in different ways. So I think that's really important for children, is to think collectively as their parents as a unit, instead of just thinking biological dad, biological mom, step parent, step sibling, and to think about how they can use communication in all of these relationships to contribute to their identity as well. And Dr. Flores asked, what are some of the more unique pro-social practices you have learned about in your research? Unique ones, again, the nicknames have proven to be something that some people mention, that, they mention in passing, but we're seeing more of it. Again, I have examples of that. So a pro-social action of giving someone a nickname and telling them why that is. Some of the pro-social actions that were mentioned in the view of the stepchild were simple things. This one child who was in their 50s when we interviewed them talked about how their stepfather, when they were fishing, shared one of his beloved Coca-Colas with him. Right. So he was known to drink these Coca-Colas. He got them in glass bottles, kept it in a cooler when they went fishing. And he never touched them because he knew it was his stepfather's. Right. And he offered that to him. That was recalled, 40 years later as being significant. So there were a ton of unique pro-social actions. Some of the common ones were walking down the aisle, having some kind of graduation ceremony where the step parent was honored in some sort of way, having a family crisis or something happen when a step parent intervened or came in and offered support when needed. Those were the more typical ones, but there's a lot of unique pro-social practices that can occur dependent on the relationships and depending on the individuals within the family. And Dr. Driscoll asked, how might addressing misconceptions that contributed to divorce be useful? For example, falling out of love suggests a narrative that means making marriage work is out of one's control. Yes, absolutely. So the words we use matter. The narratives that we tell matter. So when I talk about things like making sure your half sibling knows the backstory, making sure as a parent that you're communicating connection between others, this should be a collaborative effort. And what I mean by that is that you don't want to tell the backstory of a step family without getting your partner, the other step parent, input on it, right? So the narratives that we tell, whether they're related to our family or not, are related to our beliefs. They're related to how we want to parent. They're related to, epistemological beliefs and ontological beliefs. So it should be a collaborative effort that you are constructing this narrative with your child in mind, but also with the other members, particularly your spouse or the step parent, in mind as well. All right, another question from Morgan Edwards. In your research, have you found any challenges that children may face in showing affection to a bonus parent versus their biological parent? For instance, your close relationship with your stepmom. Have you ever felt like it would hinder or offend the relationship that you have with your biological mom? Absolutely, and there is research that points to this. So particularly the difference in affection when other family members are around. Right? So the different affection that you show when it's just me and my stepmom, hanging out at home versus when we're at a graduation where it's my, step parent, my biological parents, and all forms of siblings are at the same place. I was entered into a step family at a very young age. And the research does say that the younger a divorce and remarriage happens, tends to be easier on all parties involved. And this kind of makes sense. When you are in the age of 2 to say 8, you're basically being socialized and your personality is developing. So you're having your first relationships with friends. You're having, you're understanding what it means to be a brother or a sister or a friend or a classmate or a student. You're learning all these things through these early times. So if you can normalize the affection in those early years, if you have a stepchild that's young, that's in those socialization years, and it's communicated in a way that this is just, a parent showing you an affection, parent showing affection instead of this is your step parent showing affection, that can help. I'm not going to say that it won't, hurt people's feelings or it won't potentially cause some tension if a biological parent sees a step parent, receive that affection that they thought was reserved for them, that of course is, a feeling that's likely to occur. But again, if you've all done the work as a full family to really try to validate the importance of all the parents, whether they're step or biological, that shouldn't immediately be an affront to the biological relationship either.
Bailey, we might have time for one more question, and then I think we need to call it good for the evening. So
All
does
right.
anybody have one more question?
Trying to see if I missed any going up. Someone did ask if there was a podcast to talk about this type of research. And I was actually featured on a podcast called Red Rocks Relationships. It's actually sponsored by Dixie State University out in Utah. And I did a similar conversation that we had tonight on that. Again, it's called Red Rocks Podcast, and you can find it on Facebook and Instagram, I'm pretty sure. And they cover a lot of different topics. So friends with benefits relationships, cuddling, family relationships. So if you want to see more about blended family relationships, I was featured on that podcast as well.
You see any other questions?
I think that might be it. Y'all asked amazing questions. Thank you
They
all.
were amazing questions. Well, Bailey, thank you so much for taking the time tonight to share your research and to let us know about what we can do to actually confront some of the challenges that might be present in these kinds of families. And thank you all for coming tonight and for asking wonderful questions. We really appreciate you coming and being a part of this inaugural evening for our 2020-21 Leadership Lecture Series for the Department of Applied Communication at UA Little Rock. So excellent. And Bailey, do you want to put your email in the chat box in case people would like to be in touch with you afterwards?
Sure. And it is bmoliver1@ualr.edu. I just sent it in the chat. And I also will put in, I do have a website, it needs to be updated. But if you do, like April mentioned at the beginning, if you need anyone to do, online workshops about conflict management, about family relationships, about emotional intelligence, I am a certified group facilitator, so I can assist with that. And there's some information about that on my website.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for coming, and hope you have a good evening and stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.